Please note, Night Terrors is for a mature audience only. Episodes may contain violent images and extreme gore.
More visitors. How delightful. Well, tonight I have a tale for you, one rooted in curiosity and magic, where two young souls dared to venture where they should not. Their love for fantasy led them astray, and they uncovered something darker than any imagined beast. So gather close, listen well, and beware the traps hidden among the leaves, for this story may leave you rooted in fear. Welcome to the tale of the Lawn of Shadows.
Ethan and Oliver weren't just best friends. They were adventurers. Every day after school, you could find them in Ethan's treehouse, poring over maps of imaginary kingdoms or rolling up characters for their next Dungeons & Dragons campaign. They had spent years building an entire fantasy world, complete with ancient prophecies, hidden treasures, and dangerous creatures that only they could vanish. The walls of the treehouse were decorated with posters of their favorite fantasy games and movies, from Lord of the Rings to The Legend of Zelda. When they weren't playing D&D, they were reading the latest fantasy novels, poring over details of mythical creatures, magical spells, and epic battles. They loved nothing more than getting lost in these stories, imagining themselves as brave heroes destined to save the world.
Hey, Ethan, do you think we'll ever find something magical in the real world?
Oliver asked one afternoon as they sprawled out on the floor of the treehouse, surrounded by character sheets and stacks of dice. Ethan, ever the dreamer, stared up at the ceiling, lost in thought.
I mean, why not? There's so much we don't know. Maybe there's magic hiding all around us and we just haven't found it yet.
Oliver grinned, rolling the blue crystalline 20-sided die in his hand.
Like Mr. Thorne. He's got to be hiding something, right?
Mr. Thorne was their eccentric neighbor at the end of Dairyberry Lane, living in a slightly crooked Victorian house that seemed like it had stepped out of another century. The house itself, with its peeling paint, ivy-covered walls, and Gothic trim, had an air of mystery that always intrigued the boys. But it was the man himself who captivated them the most. Mr. Thorne was British, with a sharp, neatly kept appearance, silver hair, a slight frame, and a quiet, gentle voice that carried just enough of an accent to make him sound like he belonged in one of their favorite fantasy novels. He never dressed extravagantly, usually just a brown coat over simple clothes. But there was something about him that always seemed just a little out of place in their sleepy suburban neighborhood, as if he'd seen far more of the world than anyone else around. What really caught everyone's attention, however, was Mr. Thorne's garden. His yard was like nothing the boys had ever seen before. A chaotic yet strangely beautiful collection of statues and topiaries that seemed plucked straight from their wildest fantasies. As you approached, you would first notice the stone gnomes, about a dozen of them, peeking out from beneath bushes or standing near the path, each one frozen in a moment of play or mischief. Some had pointy red hats, while others were carved with exaggerated grins or wide-eyed expressions of surprise. There was one standing by the front gate, poised as if about to dash off somewhere important. Nearby, delicate stone fairies with wings outstretched seemed to hover mid-flight, their faces frozen in serene, knowing smiles. A pair of deer statues stood by the tree line at the far end of the yard, crafted with such lifelike detail that you could almost believe they would bound away at the slightest noise. Then there were the topiaries, the crown jewels of Mr. Thorne's garden. Bushes meticulously trimmed into fantastical shapes. A majestic unicorn with its head held high, leafy mane flowing in the breeze. A dragon curled protectively around a treasure chest, its wings stretched out as if ready to take flight at any moment. A griffin, claws raised in a permanent silent roar, guarding the entrance to the front porch. These green living creatures gave the garden an otherworldly feel, as if the entire space was alive with magic waiting to be unleashed. Among all these statues and topiaries stood a lone, colorful ornament, an iridescent ball perched atop a stone pedestal near the front walkway. It shimmered in light, catching the sun at different angles and casting brief flashes of color across all the fantastical creatures in the yard. It was the only object in the garden that seemed a bit out of place, almost forgotten amid the other marbles, though it never failed to draw the boys' attention. It wasn't just the decorations, though. It was how Mr. Thorne moved among them, as if each statue and topiary held a story he could tell in exquisite detail. He seemed to know every piece of his garden intimately, as if it were an extension of himself. And every time the boys passed by, Mr. Thorne would wave and offer a new story, one about a magical creature or a far-off land, always with that same knowing smile that made the boys wonder if there was more to the tales than just make-believe. Ethan nodded in response.
For sure. He's always telling us stories about magical creatures. Wait, what if he's really a wizard? Maybe he's retired or in hiding.
Just then, they spotted Mr. Thorne himself stepping out of his house, dressed in his simple brown coat. His silver hair caught the late afternoon sun as he walked across his lawn, his smile bright as ever. "Look, it's him," Oliver whispered excitedly. Without a second thought, the boys scrambled down the ladder from the treehouse and ran towards Mr. Thorne, their imagination racing.
"Well, hello, boys,"
Mr. Thorne called out in his British accent as they approached, his tone always warm and inviting.
"What brings you out today?"
The boys grinned, breathless from their dash.
"We were wondering about one of your lawn ornaments,"
Ethan said, gesturing towards a particularly detailed topiary, a bush shaped into the likeness of a small-winged creature with tiny claws and an impish grin on its leafy face.
"Ah,"
Mr. Thorne said, his eyes glinting as he looked at the topiary.
"That, my dear boy, is a pixie."
Oliver's eyes widened.
"A pixie? Like the one that plays tricks?"
Mr. Thorne crouched down to their level, resting one knee on the ground as he spoke.
Yes, exactly. Pixies are mischievous little creatures, known for leading travelers astray. They'll hide just out of sight in the underbrush, waiting for someone to wander too far from the path. Once they spot their target, they dart out, invisible to most, and lead you on a chase you'll never win. You'd swear you heard laughter in the woods, but when you turn around, there's nothing there, just the rustling of leaves. By the time you realize you've been tricked, it's too late. The forest will have closed in around you, and finding your way back is rather tricky."
As Mr. Thorne spoke, his voice grew softer, as if the memories of the pixie were unfolding in front of him. The boys watched, transfixed as his expression shifted, his usual smile fading, replaced by something more distant, almost wistful. For a moment, it seemed as though he wasn't talking to them at all, but reliving an experience from long ago.
"They're clever little things, pixies,"
he continued, his voice barely above a whisper.
"Always watching, waiting, and if you ever happen to cross their path, you'd better be quick, or else they'll have you chasing shadows until dawn."
Ethan and Oliver exchanged glances. There was something in the way Mr. Thorne described the pixie, something more than just a love of fantasy. It was as though he'd seen one with his own eyes, as if he were recalling an actual encounter. For a brief moment, Mr. Thorne seemed lost in the memory, his gaze unfocused, before he blinked and smiled at the boys again, the moment passing like a cloud across the sun.
"Is it real?"
Oliver asked, his voice filled with awe. Mr. Thorne chuckled softly, pulling himself back from whatever memory had taken hold.
"Oh, no, my dear boy. It's just a bit of fun, really. But that's the thing about fantasy, isn't it? Sometimes it feels real enough to touch."
As the boys walked away from Mr. Thorne's house, their minds buzzing with excitement, Oliver shook his head in disbelief.
"Did you see the way he talked about the pixie? It was like he'd actually met one."
Ethan nodded, his brow furrowed in thought.
"Yeah, he seemed different for a second, like he was remembering something real. He even got a little lost in it."
The boys exchanged a glance, both now more certain than ever that Mr. Thorne was hiding something magical. His detailed description of a pixie, the way he seemed to slip into another world as he spoke, it all added up to one thing. Mr. Thorne wasn't just telling stories. He knew something more, something real. Over the next few days, their imaginations ran wild. They couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Thorne and the possibilities that he was a retired wizard, keeping his powers hidden. What other secrets might he have hidden inside his house? What kind of spells could he cast? They spent hours imagining what they might find.
"We need to find out for sure,"
Ethan said one afternoon, the excitement clear in his voice.
"What if we caught him using magic when he thinks no one's looking?"
Oliver hesitated for a moment. "You mean
spy on him?" "Just a little," Ethan grinned. "We'll sneak over after dark and see if he does anything, magical."
Despite his nerves, Oliver's curiosity won out.
"All right, let's do it."
That night, long after their parents had gone to bed, Ethan and Oliver crept out of their houses, their hearts racing with excitement. The cool night air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the moon cast long shadows over the street as they made their way to Mr. Thorne's house. The old Victorian house stood silent, its ivy-covered walls looming in the moonlight. They crouched behind a bush near the front lawn, their eyes darting toward the various statues and topiaries that decorated the yard. The pixie topiary seemed even more alive at night, its impish grin somehow more menacing in the dim light.
"Okay," Ethan whispered. "Let's find a window where we can see him."
They carefully made their way around the house, peeking through the windows. Inside, they saw Mr. Thorne sitting in his living room, reading from a large leather-bound book. Perched on a stand near the window was his sleek black minor bird, Sebastian, watching him intently, its glossy feathers catching the light from a nearby lamp. The bird's bright yellow eyes blinked every now and then as it tilted its head, as though listening to whatever Mr. Thorne was reading. Occasionally, the bird would let out a sharp whistle or an odd repeating phrase, likely something it had learned from Mr. Thorne himself. "Shh," Oliver whispered, pulling Ethan back from the window slightly, as the bird's piercing gaze seemed to glance in their direction. The rest of the room was a mix of odd trinkets, a few crystal spheres, carved wooden sticks, and tiny statuettes, but nothing that screamed magic. The boys had expected something grander, something more fantastical. It looked more like an old man's collection of eccentric items than the lair of a powerful wizard. "Maybe he's not really a wizard," Oliver whispered, disappointed. "Maybe it's all just stories." Ethan was about to respond when a gust of wind blew through the yard, rustling the bushes and making the pixie almost seem alive. Startled, Ethan stumbled backwards, his foot knocking on the pedestal that held the colorful orb. The orb wobbled for a moment before falling to the grass with a heavy thud. Both boys froze, staring at the orb as it rolled slightly before coming to a stop. The boys hurried over to it, expecting it to be light and fragile like glass. But when Ethan tried to pick it up, He was surprised by its weight.
"It's heavy,"
he grunted, struggling to lift it. Oliver reached down to help, and together they managed to hold it up between them, though the effort made their arms strain.
"This thing feels like it's made of stone, not glass,"
Oliver whispered in awe. But it wasn't stone either. The surface was smooth and cool to the touch, but not like anything the boys had ever encountered. The texture was somewhere between metal and ceramic, with a slightly iridescent shimmer that gave it an otherworldly glow.
"Whatever it is, it's not glass,"
Ethan muttered as they examined it closely. A small chip had broken off from the side, revealing a faint glow emanating from within. The light pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat.
"It's glowing,"
Oliver said, his voice barely above a whisper.
"You don't think it's magic, do you?"
Their excitement quickly turned to panic. They had damaged Mr. Thorne's mysterious ornament, and now it was doing something they couldn't explain.
"We have to tell him,"
Ethan said, his heart racing. Without another word, they ran to the front door, still clutching the glowing orb between them. They heard footsteps approaching, followed by the sound of a lock turning. The door creaked open, revealing Mr. Thorne, who looked surprised to see them at such a late hour.
"Boys,"
he said, raising an eyebrow, "what are you doing here?"
"We're really sorry,"
Ethan stammered, holding out the orb.
"We were just, looking around, and we accidentally knocked this over. But now it's glowing. It has to be magic, right?"
Mr. Thorne's expression changed as his eyes moved to the orb in their hands. His curiosity piqued. He took it from them, turning it over and inspecting the crack where the light pulsed faintly. As he did, the boys noticed a sharp whistle from inside the house. The mynah bird, sitting on a perch in the corner of the room just behind Mr. Thorne, tilted its head and mimicked the sound of the knocking, repeating it in perfect rhythm.
"Knock, knock,"
the bird squawked, followed by a low whistle. The glossy blackbird watched the interaction with its bright yellow eyes, as if it too was interested in the glowing orb.
"Oh, that's just Sebastian,"
Mr. Thorne said casually, nodding toward the bird.
"He tends to mimic anything he finds amusing."
He gave the boys a half-smile before turning his attention back to the orb.
"Come inside. Let's see what we have here,"
he added, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. The boys hesitated before stepping over the threshold, their eyes darting around the dimly lit living room. The mynah bird let out another low whistle as it shuffled on its perch, its sharp gaze never leaving them. Mr. Thorne placed the orb on the kitchen table, the glow from the crack casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. His mynah bird Sebastian let out another whistle, shifting uneasily in its perch, as if sensing something was about to change. Mr. Thorne looked at the boys with a strange look in his eye, a look of confusion and curiosity. Then he retrieved a hammer and chisel and 3 sets of safety goggles from the toolbox. He passed out the goggles to the boys and asked them to stand back.
"Safety first,"
he chuckled. He positioned the chisel over the crack and gave it a few gentle taps. Each time the hammer struck, the light inside the orb seemed to pulse, growing brighter and more intense with each blow. The air in the room grew thick, almost suffocating. The boys exchanged nervous glances, their hearts pounding in their chests, but they didn't dare move. Mr. Thorne, however, was completely calm, focused on the task in front of him. With one final tap, the orb shattered with a sharp crack, sending shards of its strange material skittering across the table. As it broke open, a thick, swirling mist poured out, dark and cold, filling the room like a living entity. The mist moved with a purpose, snaking through the air before wrapping itself around Mr. Thorne. The boys watched, frozen in horror, as the mist coiled tighter and tighter around Mr. Thorne's body. His eyes fluttered shut, and he inhaled deeply, as if breathing in the very essence of the mist. His body straightened, his spine cracking as though he was being pulled upright by invisible strings. His face, once kindly and familiar, twisted into something sharper, more sinister. When he opened his eyes, they glowed with an eerie dark light, filled with a power that had been hidden for too long.
"Ah,"
Mr. Thorne whispered, a dark smile spreading across his face. "I am whole again." He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers as if testing his strength. His memories flooded back from the mist of who he truly was, what he had been. He was not some kindly old man living at the end of a quiet street. He was a necromancer, one of the most powerful practitioners of dark magic his world had ever known. But his crimes had been too great, his power too dangerous. The Elder Council had tried to destroy him, but they couldn't. Instead, they'd locked away his essence and banished him into this mundane world, sealing his memory and magic within the orb. "And now I am free," he murmured, his voice filled with triumph. Sebastian let out a shrill cry, flapping its wings frantically as the mist swirled around it. The bird's body convulsed, its feathers falling away to reveal leathery skin beneath. Its beak elongated, twisting into a grotesque snarl as its bright yellow eyes turned a fiery red. With a sickening crunch, its body morphed, limbs elongating into clawed hands and feet. The once innocuous bird had transformed into a demonic imp, a twisted reflection of its former self, its true self, Mr. Thorne's familiar, now restored to its original form. The imp let out a guttural hiss, its forked tongue flicking between sharp, jagged teeth as it hovered near Mr. Thorne, eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. The boys, trembling with fear, tried to back away, but they couldn't move. The mist that had filled the room now slithered toward them, cold and unrelenting, curling around their legs and arms, rooting them in place. Mr. Thorne turned his gaze on them, his smile widening. "Ah, my dear boys," he purred. "You've done me a great service, releasing me from my prison. And for that, I think it's only fair that I grant you a transformation of your own." He raised his hand, and the mist responded immediately, wrapping tighter around the boys. Ethan gasped as he felt the cold seeping into his bones. His body began to twist unnaturally, his limbs bending at grotesque angles. His skin hardened, turning gray and rough like stone. His arms cracked and buckled as they fused together, twisting into the thick, gnarled limbs of a grotesque gnome statue. His legs melded into a single stump, his feet disappearing as his lower half transformed into the base of a twisted garden ornament. His face contorted in agony as his bones broke and reformed, his mouth pulling into a wide, unnerving grin that stretched far too wide. His eyes bulged unnaturally as they turned to cold, lifeless stone, forever locked in a frozen expression of madness. Oliver wasn't spared. The mist encircled his body, and he screamed as his spine snapped, bending him forward in a grotesque hunch. His skin rippled as branches and leaves erupted from his back, twisting into wings made of thorny vines and jagged twigs. His arms elongated into grotesque clawed limbs, his fingers stretching and snapping with a series of sickening cracks. His jaw dislocated with a horrifying pop as his mouth stretched into a wide, wicked smile, his teeth elongated in the sharp, thorn-like points. Oliver's transformation was more brutal, his body torn between man and plant as he was reshaped into a living topiary, his leather wings spreading wide, his face twisted into a mock sneer. His bones broke and reformed as his entire body shifted, branches sprouting from his limbs, turning him into a twisted demonic version of the playful pixie that had once stood in Mr. Thorne's garden. The boys' screams were cut short as their vocal cords were silenced, their bodies now fully transformed into grotesque, unmoving statues, one a gnarled stone gnome, and the other a twisted pixie topiary. They stood frozen in place, their minds trapped within their new forms, aware of everything, but unable to move, to speak, to escape. Mr. Thorne stepped back, admiring his handiwork. "Perfect," he whispered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "A fitting addition to my garden." The imp flapped its wings, letting out a low, sinister chuckle as it hovered beside him. The next morning, the neighborhood was abuzz with worry. Ethan and Oliver's families were out searching, calling their names, but no one would ever find them. Mr. Thorne's house stood quiet and still, a "For Sale" sign planted neatly in the front yard. But in the garden, among the gnomes and fairies, stood two new additions, a twisted stone gnome with a grotesque grin, and a pixie topiary with thorny wings and a wicked smile. The neighborhood would never know the truth, but the boys would remain there, part of Mr. Thorne's garden, forever.
Ah, boys will be boys, or in this case, gnomes and pixies. Fantasy is a wonderful thing, but remember, some fantasies come with a price. So next time you lose yourself in those magical worlds, be sure you know the way back. Sweet nightmares.